Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today, our 10th PTRC Fireside Chat. Just a quick introduction to PTRC. If you don't know who we are a training company based in the UK, which specializes in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. We also run the annual Transport Practitioners meeting, which is happening again this July. I'll put a link in the chat if you want some more information on that. PTRC is also part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. Since April last year, we've had some great conversations during these fireside chats, and I'm really looking forward to see what this international panel has to talk about today. I'll hand over to Glenn now, who will be your chair for the discussion.
Thanks very much, Brogan, and hello everyone. My name's Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at UWE Bristol in the UK, and I'm delighted to be chairing this PTRC event, as Brogan says, number 10 in our Fireside Chat series. We've had over 300 people register today from around the world for what we look forward to being a truly international conversation about the implications for transport of the pandemic. That's at least if the global internet holds steady for us all in the different parts of the world, the different continents that we're in as a panel. A very warm welcome to our audience. Do please, as ever, make use of the chat window on YouTube to share your views and raise your questions you'd like our panel to address. And a warm welcome too to our global panel itself for today. But before we hear from them and contemplate what a cocktail of pandemic, digital age and climate crisis means for transport on this planet, I'd like to offer some scene setting. Before the pandemic, airline passengers carried globally was only going one way, inexorably upwards and steepening. The global number of passengers carried annually passed 1 billion in 1999 and had reached 4.4 billion in 2019. Then it fell off a cliff. Passengers carried in 2020 dropped by 60%. But will data points from 2020 and 2021 appear no more than a blip in the trend when we look back in 10 years' time? Aviation's inexorable rise has been running in parallel with a change from almost no one globally in 1990 using the internet to over 4.6 billion internet users at the start of this year. Unlike the cliff that aviation fell off when the pandemic arrived, internet use climbed a mountain. The BBC must have been delighted with coining its news headline, UK internet use doubles in 2020 due to pandemic. The number of internet users in Nigeria has reportedly increased by over a fifth between January last year and January this year. Headline numbers, of course, can be deceiving and mask massive disparities internationally. According to a survey by Pew Research Center in 2019, the proportion of 18 to 29-year-olds who use the internet at least occasionally or report owning a smartphone ranges from 100% in Australia, the US and UK to 65% in Nigeria and 57% in India. And for those aged 50 plus, the range is more stark than ever. And when we come back to aviation, recent research from Norway indicates that, and I quote, the great majority of the global population, nearly 90%, hardly ever board an airplane, with only 11% taking a flight in 2018 and only 4% traveling abroad. And what about down on the ground? Well, according to the TomTom Traffic Index, there was, quote, a huge drop in urban congestion levels around the world in our global cities. Compared to 2019, in 2020, Boston had 42% less traffic. Robin can let us know more about that shortly. New York had 30% less, as did Santiago, and we'll come to Juan on that. London had 18% less. New Delhi, 16%, we'll hear from Sarika, and Brisbane, 12%. Kate can tell us more. Sadly, Emmanuel, no index data for Lagos, but I know you'll be talking to us about data later. This may speak to cars, but at the same time, we've seen public transport and those dependent upon it punished by the pandemic, or at least by governmental response in many countries, in spite of lack of clarity over whether or not the public transport environment is strongly associated with virus transmission. But where's all this heading as an inequitable global vaccination program seeks to tame the virus when we look to a post-COVID future? Well, latest data from the UK Department for Transport shows that as of this week, this Monday, in fact, car traffic in Britain has grown back to over 90% of the pre-pandemic level of early 2020. Meanwhile, bus use is still more than a third less and train use more than a half less than pre-pandemic levels. As we emerge from the pandemic, we face global economic challenges, but looming large, even if seemingly still in the blind spot of many, is a climate emergency. There is therefore talk of green recovery from COVID-19. As the energy transition edges forwards for motor traffic, one could be forgiven for thinking that the global motor industry is sitting rather smugly. Use of cars and vans is bouncing back, and motor manufacturers, it could appear, are parading themselves as the green saviors of the planet as opposed to the villains as electric vehicles join their showrooms. Digital connectivity seems here to stay and may have irrevocably changed the prospects for commuting and domestic and international business travel. Will public transport, micromobility and active travel find their place in the green recovery? Which transport modes are going to be the winners and which the losers in the years ahead? And will such fortunes bode well or badly for reducing social inequality and drawing down CO2 emissions from the transport sector? There's volatility in geopolitics to contend with too, as we move towards COP26 in Glasgow in November. And transport, with its importance to the economy, is never far away. Consider, for example, in Chile, where it was a fare hike on the Santiago metro that sparked protests across the country in 2019 about high levels of inequality. In the referendum that resulted, nearly 80% of people voted to rewrite the country's constitution. We'll hear more about that from Juan, I'm sure. So much to contemplate about what the future has in store when we ask, where now for transport? And what better way now to proceed with such contemplation than to move to our international panel, representing Australia, Chile, India, Nigeria, and the United States. So without further ado, let's hear what they have to say as they offer their introductory remarks. Kate, can I come over to you first, please?
Thanks, Glenn. Fabulous opening remarks as ever. And so pleased to be here. Fabulous panel and great to hear so many people have joined online. So I was reflecting on where we've been, where we are, where we might be heading. And as you know, I had a plan for this opening statement. I had something that I prepared earlier in the week. But the last few days have really prompted me to reconsider what I was going to say and why. It's because the state of Victoria has gone into a week-long lockdown today as a result of COVID-19. We've got 26 cases in Victoria. And this brought me back to a conversation that I've been having recently with colleagues and with friends alike about uncertainty. So about adaptability, about flexibility, and about our capacity and our belief in our ability to predict the future. And I think those words are, for me anyway, the buzzwords of the last year. You know, just when you think things are settled, up in the air they go again. So I think the jury's still out as to whether, as a result of the pandemic, we'll become better at dealing with, at accepting, at managing, at planning for uncertainty. But we'll see. So I guess to the point, where we've been, where are we, where might we be heading? The challenge with answering this for Australia is that Australia is so diverse, and huge differences between the states and within the states. So amongst our population of 25 million, you know, any attempt at generalisation is difficult at best and at worst quite flawed. So as I'm based in Brisbane in Queensland, I'll probably resort to speaking about what I know, but I'll give a quick overview to try and paint the picture. We reflect on where we've been and what was good about it. I have to be completely honest, I had to go back to my emails to have a look at what 2019 was all about. I really couldn't remember. So 2019 for us in Brisbane was e-scooters. We had e-scooters launched in November 2018, and then they spread to New Zealand, and frankly, they've been a huge success here. 2019 was mobility as a service. You know, what does it mean? It was a real buzzword. How do we make it into something that a user might want? What's the offer? 2019 was national and international travel. It was conferences, it was events. 2019, it was easy to run a travel survey. In 2019, across Australia, we saw increasing public transport patronage alongside some quite significant increases in population. So where are we now? Australia's had a very different experience to most other places in the world, probably similar only to New Zealand. Our international borders were closed on the 20th of March last year, still closed, and that means that we need permission to leave, as well as there being restrictions on people coming in. A recent poll for our national broadcast, the ABC, found that 8 in 10 people think Australia is the best country in the world to be living in now, and that's gone up by 10% from a survey that was done before COVID. And certainly in Brisbane, at least, we've been back to normal, aside from a few days of lockdown, since around the middle of last year. So whilst we've been impacted, it hasn't really been to the extent of many other places. But despite that, we have seen some significant change, which I'll just touch on. So working from home has gone from being pretty unusual to being par of the course, even for some of our very traditional workplaces. Lots and lots of Teams meetings, lots and lots of you're on mute moments. City centres, we call them CBDs, central business districts, have taken a big hit with visitations down. So we're seeing a lot of push now to get people back into the city on a Fridays in the city events. We've had a huge increase in telehealth services, online doctors' consultations, big uptake in people using public spaces. Road traffic has returned to pre-COVID levels and public transport patronage is down. So it does vary between the states. So briefly, conscious of time, Glenn, where might we be heading? And I think the jury's out on this one. We have a census due later this year, which should shine a light on some of the trends. Car ownership across Australia is high. It's always been high. The proportion of households without a car is decreasing. It's only 7% at the moment, but it's going down. And the proportion of households with 3 or more cars is going up. Uptake of electric vehicles is incredibly low, and we're just starting to tax them through an introduction of a cent per kilometre charge across the states. Hybrid working does seem to be the norm, and QR codes are now part of our life. Everywhere you go, you scan a QR code. We're starting to see growing interest and capabilities in vision-led planning and managing and making decisions in the face of uncertainty, which is great. And finally, looking ahead, we'll find out this year whether Queensland has the 2032 Olympics or not. And in terms of where we're heading, that will be a huge driver, not just for Queensland, but for Australia as well. I shall end it there.
That's fantastic, Kate. What a great start. And I can't help comparing the fact that you can barely recall what happened in 2019. Then we have the volatility that you're now feeling, and yet the prospect of trying to look 11 years into the future and work out what on earth we'll be doing if we can go to an Olympics in Australia, if that success happens. So as you say, hugely challenging times if you're planning for the future. So thanks for that. We'll move on now. We'll move continents. Move from Australia. If Emmanuel can now kindly take us to Lagos, Nigeria.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to join you in this conversation, to share my understanding about Lagos, about Nigeria, and also parts from Africa. But I guess I just want to come in from a personal experience. I lived in Lagos. I was born in Lagos. My first degree in architecture was in Lagos. And I've always been interested in the built environment to really understand how things are being designed to look beyond just road transportation. And that has actually shaped my research interest to understand the travel behavior and also the level of infrastructure in Lagos, Nigeria. So just to give a bit of context, Lagos is the biggest economic city in Nigeria. Often they see as a state, as a city, but it has about 20 million people, and it's such a small place. And that has always been a huge, there's a lot of pressure on facilities. But in all this conversation, I think it's always important for us to recognize the context in terms of the developing nature of the country and also developing nature of let's say, the city. So Lagos, is a growing city, and also with the growing population, We want to discover, where are we right now? Where have we been? So this is a state whereby there's been a huge reliance on road transportation, and everybody just wants to be on the road. Though there's waterway, yes, that is not being explored. The built environment, the road doesn't really allow much for cycling or for e-scooter, as Kate might have alluded in Australia. So sometimes we talk about all these big ideas, electric cars, but in terms of the practicalities, it's quite difficult. And also that is when you recognize the informal economy in that part of the world, whereby everybody needs to go out to go and work for something they will eat today. So that means if you don't go out to work, you might not even have something to eat. And that again brings that pressure on the road. Everybody has to come out. And yes, there's this growing trend of technology working from home. But how easy is that? How feasible is that? Yes, everybody might want to work at home, but again, when you look at electricity, it's not stable. Internet is not stable. So often you might just want to go to a place whereby you have access to those facilities. And again, that brings additional pressure on the road. But also we need to recognize the political situation, because often policies are just being made for election purposes. Like the politician comes, I want to do this because I simply want to win an election. And there is no continuity, which often brings a challenge. And also that affects the level of private investment, trying to do something in that state. And like, yes, you don't know what will happen. So last year, I think about 2 years ago, some people were trying to sort of digitalize the motorcycle. So that is like, yes, you can book your motorcycle. We call it Okada. You can book it on the app. There's a lot of investment, but the government just said, sorry, we don't want that. And against a lot of people have invested so much resources into this, but the political nature of the state poses a challenge. And ultimately is all trying to really understand how to move people from point A to point B. There's a lot of pressure. Digital digital inputs are being suggested. So there's this idea of cowrie card. So like the Oyster card we have in Lagos. But we also need to recognize the level of infrastructure that needs to support that, and how much people really wants to adapt that idea. So there's a lot of prospects because the numbers are there. We need to move people, but ultimately it's important for us to have a better understanding of the travel behavior, have a better understanding of travel pattern, use data to understand these things, then transfer those research into policy, which can actually be implemented. So long term, you want to find out, yes, a place whereby there's going to be a restructuring, there's going to be less reliance on road, there's going to be less reliance on cars, so that you can also explore other means of transportation. But again, it's nice for me to be here to share my experience from Nigeria, to bring in the global context to this conversation. Thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Emmanuel. And I think what particularly struck me there was this sense of the informal economy, and perhaps the much more structured impression we have of our lives in other countries, and that sense of dependency on movement in our cities, especially like Lagos, which means the luxury of choice, which we're exploring in other parts of the world about living local and acting global, for example, as knowledge workers, just simply isn't there. But of course, you also touch very powerfully on the infrastructure challenge. It's no point having exciting new mobile technologies if the road itself is barely coping with the existing cars and that requirement people face in their lives. So fantastic, thank you for that. And we're going to move across to just before breakfast time now in a third continent, so over to Boston in the US. And Robin, we'd love to hear from you now.
Hello, thank you for having me be a part of this. It's really lovely to hear from around the world. Here in the US, taking the cue from Kate and thinking back, what has really been striking is our presidential election happened, and really understanding and profoundly the divisiveness that's happening in this country. And I would say the very different worldviews on the urban and rural divide and how people are living in different lives with different realities. And as well as we've had the rise of the Black Lives Matter and really having equity and racial justice issues front and center. So it's been something that if you ever had wanted to avoid it, or if you had not seen it before, you now really are seeing it and thoughtful. When I think about the pandemic, so my life's work has really been on climate change for the last 20 years and thinking about urban transportation through that lens. As Kate noted, I'd say pre-pandemic, we were really focused on all the innovations that were happening in the shared micromobility space. And I really am very excited about the potentials of electric micromobility as a method of changing how people feel about active transportation and what could that unlock. What the pandemic did, layering on that, I think it had a couple of very, hopefully far-reaching, and it's going to be up for us to see whether it's far-reaching or not, effects. One was we had the reality of a need for resilience in the transportation sector. So if you were just car dependent, you are now trapped inside your house. And what does that mean for you to be able to get anything done? If you are used to take transit and you're an essential worker, now you're not wanting to take transit, and what are your other modes? I was particularly interested by the introduction of this idea of essential worker. And I don't know if that's happened in other countries, but we had this idea of who were essential workers and what were essential requirements for life. So that included health, primarily health, sanitation, and food acquisition. And what was really interesting from a transportation standpoint was it was recognized that those essential workers were largely getting to work using public transportation. And when public transportation, I'd say, went into its free fall of no one can get, not letting many people get on it, and then having fare and revenue issues, it really put this nice highlight on the centrality of public transportation, and particularly for low income workers and those essential workforce. So the other thing that happened is we had a lot of pilots of road space reallocation in cities, as happened around the world. So bringing those ideas forward, I look at this and I think, can we take, I think we all are ready to, I think humans are ready to just move on very quickly and go back to the status quo. And I feel like we, as I want to call us all activists, actively working and engaged in this sector, how can we bring forward and capture the things that we did learn and let us not fall back to the status quo? I mean, we talk back about build back better here, or, and the question is, can we have the political will to do that and bring that memory forward? And then lastly, for me personally, because of the election and because of the Black Lives Matter things, I have been looking very closely into transport, and I have this new recognition that in a car-dominated society, and I would say even Nigeria is car-dominated, even though most of the population doesn't own a car, its infrastructure has been built out in a car-dominated way. In this country, we have 50% of the population at any given moment doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't have access to a car, or doesn't have the money to spend on fixing that car or putting fuel in that car. And 50% is 50%, which is just so striking to me. And so one of the ways I'm trying to get us to think differently and think about moving from monomodal to a multimodal is to have everyone look around and recognize that they themselves fit into this trapped world, that they themselves, when they were less than 16, when they have an elderly parent, when their spouse has taken their car, when they lost their job and they can't afford to buy fuel to put in the car, that we're all every day, week by week, month by month, in the number of people who need to have resilience in their transportation options. And I just going forward, that's a space where I'd love us to have one of the goals of the transport sector to provide, to make car independence or car ownership as an option to movement. And that will build in and address things like climate, health, equity, economic imperatives. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Robin. And as with our other introductions, just huge ideas sparking off, what you've said. I wrote down minority rule, picking up several of your comments. This sense, you made reference across to Nigeria and this sort of perverse situation, which will be true in other parts of the world, where the minority class are dominating our infrastructure and the experience that the majority are having. And I love this 50% idea. And of course, if you fold that into, most people are not white and not male. When we add that with your way of observing that, we're just seeing even more that sense of minority.
Just one more comment, just because of Juan's, your quick introduction, or Juan's about to come, is it's so exciting that Chile is rewriting its constitution, because it might be able to correct for this reality that's happening in my country and other countries where the fewer people are dictating what the majority wants.
Yeah, and without stealing all of Juan's thunder, but I was reading this morning how I think only a quarter of the seats on this important body that will be writing the new constitution for Chile are from the ruling party. So great opportunity perhaps for majority rule, in a sense, picking up some of your points, Robin. And also I couldn't help but noticing almost not a contradiction in what you were saying, but this sense of divisiveness that we're experiencing around the world, and yet hopefully a greater awakening to white privilege and male privilege that we should be addressing. So in many senses, we're not even getting to the technical solutions for transport. We're dealing with these fundamental socio-political issues. But before being drawn into the urgency of discussing these matters, let's come to our next introduction from Juan. So we move down to South America and Concepcion.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's been like a century since 2019, I think, for everyone, and especially in the case of Chile. I think we have had 3 shock waves very strong. The first one is that in 2019, Chile was organizing COP25. We basically had a new Ministry of Sciences that was gathering some key ideas regarding climate change, the climate crisis. Especially there was a commission in terms of transport. There was a lot of discussion about what to do. And that was up until October 2019, when there was a small rise in the fares in the subway system in Santiago. Small, this is maybe $0.25, which is, and it was actually very small, even for Chilean standards. But that was the last drop in the glass that basically make a big change, a big social change. There was really what I call a revolution. It wasn't, fortunately, a very violent revolution. It was a big change, and started in the subway system in Santiago. Of course, it was a much more high crisis, but somehow is also how transport has been intertwined in these big shockwaves and crises. And that crisis started in the middle of October and lasted for a month, up until middle of November. And we, as a society, we really did know what to do. And there was we have actually our first lockdowns were in October 2019. We experienced some kind of a pre-COVID experiences with this political crisis. And I think that's very interesting, because somehow paralyzed us, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, make us to reflect what was going on in the city, in the country, in terms of dignity, in terms of equity, and also in terms of what we were building in our cities and in the rural sectors as well. The end of that crisis, or the begin, or basically the starting of the exit of that crisis was an agreement in November 2019 of starting to write a new constitution. So basically to give an electoral referendum. That's political, but I think it's very important, because somehow the crisis, the thinking of this two crises, especially the political one, sparked by transportation issues, sparked by the daily life issues, somehow made us to reflect that there were things that were not going on fine. And that was very important, because somehow and then we were on that mood. We said, well, unfortunately, we cannot organize COP25. Actually, COP25 moved to Madrid. And then after that issue, well, then we have COVID-19 in March 2020. We have been one of the countries that have experienced most lockdowns all over the world. But more than that, the same issues that were raised in the society in terms of equity, in terms of dignity, started to sparkle more and more during last year. And I think that's very important, because, for example, we have a survey that the fifth most rich of the people could telework. 80% of the fifth could telework, whereas the poorest fifth, just 20% of them could telework. So we have a huge inequality and the question of dignity that started on this political revolution somehow continued and actually sparkled more in the COVID-19 crisis. And in terms of transportation, that was a huge dimension. Still in Chile, half of households don't own a car. So the reliance of public transport, the longest distances we have as sprawls, most of our cities are sprawling in a very fast pace. So somehow all these issues started to raise more and more questions, to raise more and more contradictions in the way we were living in the country. So 2020 somehow passed through these two crises in parallel. We have a referendum. We somehow, as Glenn pointed out, there was a referendum in favor of the Constitution. We have elections just a couple of weeks ago, where actually one of the interesting things around is not only parties of a ruling party. The majority of the people from the Constitution do not belong to a political party, and I think that also links to the questions of global crisis and transportation, because the new agenda they're bringing to the constitutional discussion is the agenda of climate crisis, of dignity, and of changing a lot of the foundations that we had in Chile for 30 or 40 years, where there was more the key idea was the right of choice, and thinking more in terms of the market was going to be the key driver for most of the living, and that is really moving towards a different solution. And just taking Kate's point, this is also the key uncertainty as well. What will happen with our constitution? What will happen with COVID-19? What will happen with global crisis? Is still a big open question. We have not only shaken our foundations in terms of the public transportation system, but also our political system. And somehow these three things are intertwined. And I think that's the interesting thing. And in my opinion, maybe I'm an optimist, but somehow that also brings me hope about the future in the Chilean context. And just a small thing prior than just continue discussion. This is a trend that is maybe not as strong as in other countries in South America, but we are seeing similar things in Colombia and in Argentina, for example. And I think that's something that somehow sparks in this part of the world that is interesting to keep an eye.
Thank you very much, Juan. And the global internet is just about allowing us all to stay together, which is wonderful so far. Yeah, I mean, again, just very powerful there. And your sense of being an optimist in the face of a compound crisis, but it gives a sense of opportunity emerging from Kate's sense of volatility. And yet I suspect in our conversation, we may come to the question of, in spite of the crisis, are we still failing to seize the opportunity that lies within it? But I guess we look to Chile to see how this new constitution, if indeed it's voted for by the electorate in due course, really brings structural change to addressing social inequality and so on. I was reminded also of our conversations together in 2019, when I think we looked at the carbon emissions per capita in Chile and the UK, and they were remarkably almost the same, until we looked at the trend lines and realized that Chile has a line going upwards and the UK has one for the whole economy going downwards. And of course, you mentioned that, you know, sprawling cities are still a phenomenon, and for those who can afford the car is still a sense of first choice. And I'm seeing comments in the chat bar already about a sense of frustration that the car is emerging as the answer, when in a sense it's been part of the problem. But let's jump one more continent before we open up the conversation for us all. Sarika, can we head to New Delhi, or a neighborhood nearby, I believe, which is where you're based? Please tell us more. And of course, we're globally only too well aware that the spotlight of COVID is very aggressively on India right now. So we're especially pleased that you're able to join us.
Thank you so much, Glenn. And if when I hear about, you know, Australia or UK or Chile or in US, so I think we are not so different when we think about post and pre-pandemic and the transportation sector, when we correlate to it. So in India, it is very, very different actually. When we think, you know, when we say work from home, it doesn't work because 95% of our workforce is informal. They are totally dependent on, you know, public transport, walking and cycling infrastructure. But unfortunately, what we have is, you know, in all our planning, in all our decision making, in all our design, focusing on more and more car-oriented infrastructure, focusing more and more cities building which are dependent on car. So somehow there is a huge gap between the thought process, the ideas, the policies, and implementation. There is a huge gap because in 2007, we launched the National Urban Transport Policy in our country, which says that move people and not vehicles. But we are almost 15 years after that, we are still struggling to have a good footpath, good walkway in our city. We don't even have a basic infrastructure where a pedestrian can walk in a city. Then we have 2% of global motor vehicle, but 98% of our infrastructure are built for cars. Pre-COVID, you know, there is a lot of dependency, a lot of implementation is towards building more and more infrastructure for vehicles. And there somewhere, you know, we are so much into contributing into air pollution and road traffic deaths in our country. That is somewhere we need to start. When we look into the statistics, that 10 cities in India, the top 10 cities where, like, you know, in terms of air pollution, we are again leading in the road traffic death. 10% of the global road traffic deaths is from India. But why? As a country, we always been very participatory in all global forums, talking about, you know, sustainable transportation or road safety or air pollution. But when it comes to governance, when it comes to implementation, somewhere there is a huge gap. Though we have very nice policies, we implemented Jalwal Urban Renewal Mission to promote city bus services. Then we built metros in multiple cities. So we have touch-based everything. Like, for example, even in electric mobility, I think we have, as a country, in various states has developed their own policy on electric mobility, but we are far away from implementing it. Second thing, we implemented like more than dozen of cities, you know, through our smart city program, implemented a bike sharing system. Again, it's not robust. Again, it is, again, somewhere we failed. So this failing somewhere is a very deterrent to, where we are and where we have to move. So, I'm very positive, we are still a developing country, and from last 2 decades only, I think we started discussing about sustainable transportation in our country. So I have hope somewhere that, hopefully there will be a focus on the minority and not the majority, who are, always vocal about, car-centric development and car-centric planning, and focusing on inclusive public spaces and street designs. So, and fortunately, I must say, after COVID in 2020, the Ministry of Urban Development has launched the Cycle for Change program and Street for People program, and where more than 100 cities participated and started looking into more city-centric planning, focusing on walking and cycling infrastructure, integrating public transport into walking and cycling infrastructure. This is somewhere we have started last year after COVID, realized that we really have to work towards more and more people-centric infrastructure, rather than building more and more flyovers and underpasses for the cars. So I think we have opportunity. We're just starting. We have opportunity to learn from other countries' best practices, especially city like Mexico, Chile, Bogota, and all that, where they have showcased that, with the population, because most of our city, if you see like Mumbai or the city I'm living, Gurgaon, I can compare to Bogota easily, the kind of population we have, kind of sprawl development we have. So easily we can achieve what the cities has achieved in last 20, 30 years. This is what, if we, as a country, I'm looking forward that the governance system can focus on such kind of development, and looking into that, the people who are dependent on public transport to their workforce cannot move to vehicle. Nobody, for example, as Robin said, everyone cannot afford a car, but unfortunately, after COVID in our country also, the vehicle sale has gone up to 50%, especially the two-wheelers, because most of the people have to go to the work. And somehow this whole COVID has, pushed a lot of people and families into poverty in my country. That's why the focus has to be improving walking and cycling infrastructure in our city. And we even don't have the basic infrastructure. That is somewhere we are really lacking behind compared to other countries and other cities.
Thank you very much, Sarika. Again, just a rich sense of insight that we've been given in that short few minutes about the challenges, but maybe some degree of hope and opportunity that your country and cities within it are dealing with. And we must just mention, if it comes up in later in the conversation, to hear some more about Ragiri Day when we find the moment, because you've been very modest in not sharing so much about the wonderful things you've been achieving personally in creating that movement for change across cities in India in terms of active travel and reclaiming the streets, as we might say. I love the fact you made mention briefly about learning from each other, learning from other countries. And, maybe one of the other blessings that comes from the pandemic is that here we are across continents today, able to share, thanks to the telecommunications, first-hand experiences about what's happening in political terms, in terms of street space reallocation and so on, from each other. But I couldn't help sensing from you, and maybe from the others, this feeling of the distinction between behavioral intention and actual behavior. And I'm talking really about political will and ability to really enact the change that some of the policies are aspiring to achieve. And if I look back across all your introductions, it always sounds rather dramatic to say that we're dealing with wicked problems, but we truly are, aren't we? We're not just dealing with technical solutions to optimizing traffic flow through an interchange. These are really ever more fundamentally challenging and almost intractable challenges that we have. What I'd like to do, and I know the panel will have sight of some of the questions coming in from the audience, but I wanted to pick up on 2 or 3 of those and see if we can feed that into starting the discussion. So John Carr felt as though John was lamenting as one of the first commentators, saying, my goodness, are we all being told EVs are the answer? Is that really all we've got to offer globally? And then Roger Whitty asks about what's the sense of climate emergency in the different countries we're able to hear from today. Yes, we have COP26, but as Juan mentioned, not long ago, COP25 was going to be happening in Chile and didn't and was moved. So how much seriousness is there out there to grasp the gravity of the climate emergency? And then from Portugal, Catarina Salles. In fact, Catarina asked us a question before today's event, but coming back to that, her real sense for Portugal as well is that the winner out of all of this, perversely, seems to be the car. And are we really screwed? I mean, is this it? We don't worry enough about climate change. The car is king, and we're struggling to find a way out of it. So I just wonder, let me see if I can turn that into a question. Do you see a real prospect that the change that's needed is going to happen, or are we stuck in this perpetual cycle of optimism and disappointment? And whoever'd like to jump in first, Robin, I think might be wanting to come forwards.
Just a couple of those things do tie together in the US. So we've had a change of leadership. And as you know, President Biden has put together his cabinet in a way that really does put climate forward, which has been a remarkable piece. So there's a real political commitment to address these twin issues of climate change and inequality and racism in the US. That said, when I look at this very big budget proposal he has put forward called the Jobs Act, in the transportation sector, which is getting the largest share of this budget effort, and then within that, the biggest push is on $174 billion, which is a ton of money, has been on electrification of vehicles. When I look at that, it makes me cry, and I see from the chat that it makes a whole bunch of us feel like, why is there a lack of understanding that doubling down on, yes, the cars that exist should be electric without question, but we are doubling down on the climate and equity mess that cars brought to us. And so I feel like so as I look at that with trying to be optimistic and careful in giving them every potential possibility of doubt, I'm thinking to myself, okay, do they really, I think the people in the transportation department and likely some others realize that car ownership and one car for every adult over the age of 16 is not the path forward. But do they do this? But do they do this in order to bridge the divide of a divisive population who is not there yet? So that's, I guess, my positive answer is it possible that the people who are running things realize that isn't the way forward, but we have to say these things and we have to do these things in order to make this transition? And that is a big question for me. We had discussed this before, how do we address the political piece in our movement towards a very dramatic change in how things are done?
Thanks, Robin. And if I recall, President Biden's not far past his first 100 days. So pretty impressive stuff so far. But I guess the question I'll leave you with, but I want to bring Juan in because he's wanting to follow up on this. But how might you spend $174 billion differently to get a better bang for your buck, given the challenges we face? But Juan, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something very interesting that happened 2 days before our October revolution. There was a Chilean Congress of Transportation Engineering, and the Ministry of Transportation was showing the key measures on climate change. And she showed a number of things, but she said, we will concentrate on electric vehicles because this is the easiest way of handle the issue. And I think that's really what most of the politicians are still thinking about. And after that, I think that my reflection is that we need to rebalance the power of thinking and rebalance the power of measures. In Chile, electric vehicles is not only the technology that will make cars cleaner. Is a technology that, for example, will extract lithium from the northern part of the country, where a lot of economic resources and interest from several powerful groups. And I think we cannot be naive about these dimensions of power. Of course, we're not talking about political economy only, where we work in a specific sector of the transportation, and we have our limitations. But I think it's very important to point out that this balance of power in terms of the interests regarding electric vehicles, but also regarding how to cope the climate emergency is key here. A second thing that I think is very interesting to point out, in the case of Chile, we have a huge problems with basically funding people who, who didn't have money for the COVID-19 crisis. The answer to the government was to give an advancement of the pension plans for the people. Most of the people who really got the money, the first thing they did was to buy a car. And we're expecting a huge increase in car ownership. Is because there hasn't been some solutions on the one hand from the public policy, but on the other hand, the hints that we have had are really towards cars. So we really have to rethink about the balance of power in terms of the public opinion, but in terms of what to do in terms of these dimensions.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. And as you talked there, and Robin's point, it reminds me of work many years ago, my colleague Susan Kenyon on social exclusion, where we have this perverse situation where the solution to inequitable transport and transport-related exclusion is to provide a car, which actually exacerbates the very exclusion itself. So let's just pass that balance of PowerPoint over to Kate and Manuel and Sarika. So Kate, what's your feeling on balance of power? Is it just too seductive, this sweet spot of EVs equals economic recovery equals greening business as usual and being seen to do something about the planet? Are we going to escape that? Is what's happening in Australia?
So in the EV space, really not very much is happening there. The position that's been adopted by the national government is that that there will be no subsidies for EVs. So unless they stack up on their own 2 feet economically, then we're not going to see them here for very long. And if you look at everywhere where they have taken off, they've all been subsidised quite heavily. So I think the issue we have in Australia, trying to choose my words quite carefully, is back to your point, Glenn, about the climate crisis being a wicked problem, and it really is in Australia. In our last federal election, the party that got into power with a sizable majority got in on essentially an anti-climate change agenda. And looking at polls, just one out yesterday that was asking people what they think is most important. Affordable housing came a long way above addressing climate change. So it's an issue in many parts of Australia, but at a national level, the focus is very much on jobs and on economic recovery.
Thanks, Kate. And before I come to you, Emmanuel, I'm just going to go to Sarika, because I note Sarika's reminded us, and to some extent it will resonate, I think, with parts of the Australian discourse, a huge reliance on coal for the electricity. So electric cars are really, a displacement, possibly an efficiency gain in terms of where the emissions and how much of them, but they're still there being produced in the system. Sarika, what's your balance of power? You've mentioned some wonderful policy documents, but perhaps those policies are still constrained by this power struggle, are they?
We have a national level policy also in many states. For example, Delhi is the first state to introduce the electric vehicle policy in the state. But in our country, most of our electricity is still based on coal power. And if you are talking about climate change, then that cannot be done. For example, you need to look into alternative electricity provided, either solar or wind or whatever. So before jumping into electric vehicle, we need to understand what all support infrastructure which is again environmental friendly. We just can't say that this or that. That cannot happen. If we are shifting, we are saying that by 2030, all our vehicles, like our minister has announced that by 2030, all our vehicles is going to be electric. But where is the roadmap? Where is the plan? In 5 years, where is a 5-year plan that these are the support infrastructure we are going to build? We have very informal kind of electric mobility in our country. For example, most of our 3-wheelers, we call it e-rickshaws, are shifted to electric vehicle now. They have a particular informal charging stations. Many private operators have jumped into it and it's running very nicely. But what happened to the batteries? But where they are going after 5 years or 7 years, where their life is all these things we need to understand and it can't be copy paste from other countries, because we need to understand where our electricity is coming. We need to understand what kind of support infrastructure we have. We need to understand the safety of this. So many things are there before we are announcing or jumping into a number. So I must say that first we need to improve our solar energy system so that we have surplus of solar energy before saying that by 2030 all our vehicle is going to be electric vehicle. We need to understand the charging infrastructure that easily, like for example, we have a gas stations and we go and fill our gas, but about charging infrastructure, what exactly we need? If I have a vehicle in my residential complex, how I am going to charge, how many kilometers I can drive, do I have another charging station in my destination point? So all these things are there. One good thing is that a lot of private sector, a lot of corporate, a lot of industry leaders are working towards improving electric vehicle in our country. For example, the organization I work, it's a software company, and we have shifted all our cab system for our employees to electric vehicle, and we have our charging station and all these things are there, but it is a mix shift. If we think as a country, we need to develop a robust system before and shifting it wholly.
So building on what Sarika said, Emmanuel, was very struck in the introduction, if I'm getting my numbers right, that the population of Lagos is the same as the population of Australia. Forgive me if I've got those numbers wrong, but when we talk about looking at the global picture for the climate challenge, the UK, it's COP26 in Glasgow. We have legally binding commitments to zero emission economy, net zero by 2050, but we're a small part of the global picture. So when we come across to Lagos and Nigeria, and we think about Sarika's notion of thinking about how we're going to plan and then planning a roadmap to do something that might happen and so on, will we ever reach the point we need to in the time we've got left, Emmanuel? And what's the feeling in Nigeria? Is climate change so far away from people's most urgent priorities?
I guess that will be the answer, because I think at this stage, you need to recognize what is that immediate need of the woman on the roadside that needs to get from point A to point B. How many people actually recognize what is climate change? Who cares about that when I'm not even able to sustain myself to get the transport for tomorrow? So I guess there is also the benefit of this kind of global conversation. Yes, UK, Australia, America, yes, everybody is aware of that. But you also need to recognize that in some part of the world, there is no enough awareness about what it is, and talk less of putting policies in place. So let me give you an illustration about electricity. You don't even have enough electricity to power your freezer in the house. Would you now use that electricity to power a car? So those kind of basic infrastructures are not there yet. How many people can afford a car to even start putting petrol in that car? Talk less of now buying an electric car and trying to maintain it. It's not on the agenda right now. So I recognize climate change, yes, is there, but we need to recognize that there are inherent challenges among these different countries. I'm talking from Lagos, Nigeria. It's not something that can be, I tell you, 2030. It can be possible because you need to address the basic need first, make sure there's enough electricity to go around for you to be able to say, I can have uninterrupted electricity for 48 hours. Then you can actually tell people about electricity or electric car, then this can be possible, but also in terms of the infrastructure. But I think in all of this, we need to raise that awareness. We need to let that conversation start coming up. Let people start recognizing, okay, there's something like climate change. What can I do as an individual? Instead of me getting a car, can I be walking? But again, you want to think about it. My work is, I have to travel to this place to work. I can't work from home. So it's there. Climate change is there. The population is huge. And you can imagine amount of CO2 emission that is coming out from that part of the world. But I must tell you, it's not top priority now. So that's just my main point around that idea.
Yeah, and as you're talking, Emmanuel, I'm thinking, of course, social inequality operates at all different levels, right from individual right up to global. But one starts to get a sense of, in the same way as Robin's talking about Biden's budget of $174 billion, primarily on EVs, and how might we spend that differently? Are we looking globally enough? So is the UK and the US and some other developed countries actually better off helping other parts of the world in terms of their development, in order that the overall emissions footprint is tackled more effectively? There seems to be this ever-present selfishness that we're seeing, and of course, if we look to the way the world has behaved in terms of introducing the vaccine for the virus, huge inequality in the way that program's being dealt with. I mean, can I ask the panel as a whole, and perhaps come back to Robin, do you see, as we move forwards, inequality simply getting worse or no better? And does that mean it's going to compound the problems we're facing globally? Or do you have any words of optimism for us about how this opportunity that Juan talked about in his introduction can be seized in a sense of new change?
For the last few years, every single talk I gave in front of large audiences, I would end the talk with this question. I would say, everyone shut your eyes. I'm going to ask a survey. Do you believe that we will address climate change and income inequality by evolving existing governments and existing companies? Or do you think it will require a revolution to address these challenges? And I would have people do it with their eyes shut. And horrifyingly, 80 to 90% of the people in every audience and every circumstance, never talked to poor people, but I would talk to students, venture capitalists, CEOs, governments, it's going to take a revolution to do it. And we know that revolutions are terrifying. So I look at the political climate today in the US, in Europe, we saw in Chile, everywhere. Can governments feel the palpability and the closeness of revolution in their streets? And will that encourage them to move faster? Or we see with also the other response is, let's turn to dictatorship, white supremacy, status quo, and maintain, put a double put cement on the lid and keep it down for a while longer. There was just a question from the audience about what can people do? I think we all, in every day, in our local politics, in our regional politics, our national politics, need to be much, much more engaged and much louder to give the politicians that exist the power and the will to make these changes faster, to say, I will re-elect you if you do these things, and I won't re-elect you if you don't.
Thanks, Robin. I'm wondering if the rest of our panel, did you have your eyes closed at that point? Did you all arrive at revolution? I have to say I did. Hands up if you arrived at revolution in relation to Robin's question. It's not obligatory for us all to vote the same way.
Can I tell you what one was really terrifying? The first time I gave this talk, I was giving a talk at the White House to the executive office staff. So all the young people between the age of 25 and 40 who are working on US policy. This was under Obama when I first started this. And in that room, with their eyes open, 60% said it'll take a revolution. And that made me not sleep for 3 days.
Wow. Emmanuel, you didn't have your hand up, and I'm not singling you out other than to do tell us some more. What are your thoughts here?
It's quite, maybe because of my personal connection with this, because I'm torn between two worlds. I'm torn between UK, whereby I see what is going on, and I'm torn between Nigeria, where I see what is not going on. So think about it. Australia as a whole country, like you said, is about 25 million. Like Lagos, just one state, it's about 22 million. So you can imagine what one state is generating compared to what a whole country. And we're talking about inequality here. Like it's easier for, let's say, the developed countries to adopt some of those things, but we need to recognize these inequalities. It's not just about having it in the policy. If a government is not doing this, we might not elect you. Even if the government is not aware of that, it might not even be in the election agenda. So again, this is something we need to recognize. So I guess I would say, I'm not being pessimistic, but I think till 2020, till 2030, if the 25 million in Australia can do that, let them keep doing it gradually, things will start changing. Then another part of the world might come in. But to have one cap fit all, to have one date for everybody, I don't think that would be feasible. So in terms of revolution, talking from Nigeria, from Lagos, I don't think that is a revolution for climate change, not that's on the agenda. But I guess
climate change and addressing inequality, those two.
And so do we think, I mean, I'm interested, maybe Sarika, you can come in, but I'm also interested as I pass the mic over to you. Have we got a panel here of socially oriented urban planners who see the world through one lens? Is there another panel out there, maybe all white male, I don't know, I'm being terribly judgmental, that would be saying tech's going to fix all this, don't worry, we're going to have economic growth, it's going to be wonderful, and I can reassure you, politician, that steady as you go. But Sarika.
So totally agree to Robin. Actually, we need total reform in our political system, in our governance, when we are talking about climate change and equality. Again, climate change, who is basically impacting due to climate change? Again, the poor in the country, especially in my country. The poor are basically the victim of the climate change. Either it is air pollution or anything, either every year we have the cyclones and earthquakes and multiple things, and the poor who are getting impacted. For example, in our Himalayas, this whole flooding, again, poor are getting impacted. This climate change and inequality is always walking together, and there we need to break it. And if you are talking about climate change, then we need to focus on work towards improving the quality of life of the poor. And it is not about the 10% of the population, it is about the 90% of the population. How we are going to improve the quality of life of the poor in the country. And it's all, again, from their transportation, mode of transportation, improving the transportation facility for them, to other employability, and multiple other things. So all these dots need to be connected together, and total reform on the governance system. That is what we need. When our country said that we are going to build 80 kilometers of road every day, where we are leading to. I wish my country say that we are going to develop 100 kilometers of cycle track every day, walkways every, footpath every day, and cycling related infrastructure every day.
And Sarika, just on that, I'm looking at Dirk van der Laan's comment in the audience. He's wanting to know, do you think movements like your Ragiri Day, these car-free areas on Sundays all over India, are you expecting them to gain more momentum? And I'm wanting perhaps to turn our last part of the conversation to being a bit more optimistic, which is why I'm going to come back to Juan next, because he's declared himself our optimist. But there's the saying, of course, that change can sometimes be much slower than you want it to be in the short term, and much more dramatic than you could ever imagine it would be in the longer term. So if we look to India, if we look to your Ragiri Day movement, and we look forwards a few more years, could you imagine that this state of flux we're experiencing now has been an opportunity that you can seize the initiative and capture the hearts and minds of those who've been perhaps isolated from the power and the discourse of shaping the cities?
Absolutely. Yes, I can see a lot of opportunity in almost all Indian cities actually, and it has somehow improved. For example, last year, as I said, the ministry has launched the Cycle for Change program. Somehow from zero to we have few kilometers of cycle tracks in our city now. So India is, I think, one of the best examples where we can say that, hey, we can really reach to that, where we can really improve the system and the infrastructure for in terms of sustainable mobility. When we talk about sustainable mobility, because we are not was like city like any other, for example, Los Angeles or something, where already so much of built infrastructure is there and we cannot change it. We are in the right time where we can act. We have opportunity to improve this kind of infrastructure and system in place. We just need a little bit of political willingness and little bit of improvement in our governance system. That's it.
Okay, so with that, I'm passing over to Juan. I'm just going to remind the rest of the panel, what I'll come to what might be our last main question, is one that we set up before. So let me just read that out. If you had the power to make it happen, what would good look like in terms of transport in 2030? But before we come to that, and I'll ask Kate to perhaps have a go at that first, but Juan, perhaps Chile has this golden opportunity with this remaking of the constitution. Is it going to prove to be a missed opportunity, or do you really have hope that it can change? And what might it look like? How might it be different, do you think?
Well, I have hopes, but of course we have to be cynic about those hopes, because there are a lot of forces that are going on at the same time. One of the interesting things that have happened is that the mainstream discourse of politicians have become irrelevant now. Of course, they're relevant for the country, but the mainstream discourse in terms of technology and all of that has proven to be relevant for the now the discussions. We're talking about the right of the housing, the right of accessing the city, a number of other things. And I don't know if I disagree with Emmanuel, but somehow I have a different view in terms of what climate change involves, and just picking up some of Sarika's points as well. I think revolutions are for those who are uncomfortable, and those who are uncomfortable in general are those who are poor, but also those who suffer climate change. And maybe you will go to people who suffer floods or who suffer a lot of different dimensions in how cities are shaped now, and they may not have an explicit thinking about climate change on their minds, but definitely they are up to this. In COVID-19, for example, there were a number of places, of areas in medium-sized cities that really had no access to basic services. And then they realize the value of the local, the value of walking. And of course, climate change is not an explicit word there, but somehow is really what makes people uncomfortable, what makes the change. And somehow that's also why I'm hope, because people realize, and we have basically, people is now realizing that those uncomfortabilities have to change or need to be changed through this kind of revolution. And I'm not thinking about revolution that may lead to a dictatorship, but seriously revolution where you, and let me go back to a point before, to rebalance somehow the power in terms of the changes that you can have.
Thanks. And I think, I mean, of course, this word revolution has become perhaps a key part of this conversation. And just as you said, Juan, it doesn't necessarily signal always, very violent action, which may or may not lead to dictatorship. But it does remind me, I was mentioning to the panel before we started, having just bought a book, White Supremacy and Me. And white supremacy sounds so extreme, and yet it's actually the everyday problem that we're facing as just one of these wicked problems. And I suppose revolution could well be a quiet revolution amongst the masses in how we start to change our attitudes and the norms of behavior in everyday circles, rather than necessarily the protests we've seen. And of course, in the UK, the opportunity to protest is potentially being locked down in the way that you had locked down in Chile. So yes, I wonder what shape revolution might take, but also you mentioned that it's the poor or the disenfranchised who perhaps are most in the front line for wanting to revolt. And what we're seeing perhaps is a spreading of that sense of need for change and revolution to the wider populace and the younger staffers that Robin mentioned in the White House. But Kate, we must find some optimism, and we're going to start with you. So you're in charge now. You can have $174 billion. We'll pass it over from Biden to you. What can you achieve for us in the next 10 years?
So in addition to buying another boat, going sailing for a long time, great question. So I think the first thing would be that it's not just about transport, it's about access. So everything is focused on how people can access goods and services, and transport will be a part of that, but it's not everything. The other thing would be, the focus on, and this has been touched on a lot, equity. So it's equitable access to services. So income isn't a determinant on what you can, where you can get your jobs, how you can get to your jobs, and what sort of jobs you've got. Picking up on something that's a real issue in Australia, it would be about, making sure that transport and land use decisions were made hand in hand. We have a real issue with first mile, last mile across Australia. And then aligned with that is that the decisions would be focused on a vision rather than just simply meeting targets. We've had in the past some very ambitious growth targets, and everything's crafted around meeting that rather than saying, what do we want our places to be and how can we meet those? And then down to some specifics, because this is quite fun. I'd love to see rail services across Australia that compete with air travel. So it's as easy and as quick to get a train between Sydney and Melbourne or Brisbane and Melbourne than it is to fly. I'd love to see green energy powering our electric vehicles. To Sarika's point, we've got intensive coal-fired power stations, so EVs just are not going to stack up for quite a long time. And I'd love to see shared cars available for trips when it's not economical to use public transport and you can't use active transport. And that would, we've got significant rural and regional communities, and that would help there too.
That's great, Kate. And shared cars is such an obvious segue for me to pass the microphone to Robin. Tell us, Robin, shared cars, is that going to be part of the 10-year plan?
I'm loving that you said that word, of course. I'd love to see us in 2030 where we had reallocated street space in dense urban areas and made a very safe network of low speed, lightweight movement, so walking, biking throughout, so that people could truly live a multimodal life. And when we came to, and that we had moved from single occupancy cars to single occupancy electric micromobility. If you wanted to be going by yourself someplace, you wouldn't be taking that big car, you'd be taking something smaller and lighter and on those safe roads. And where we were using what I think of as the heavy metal infrastructure, which I want to say, I'm a firm believer that we need multimodal choice, that we would have built out in the dense urban areas a robust, heavy backbone of rail and transit, metro, and that the remaining vehicles that are powered by electricity are what I think of as shared vehicles, or that you're paying the price. If you choose to go by yourself, you aren't. So I think of shared vehicles as everything from the subway all the way up to a taxi with 2 people in it. So those are all shared, and some of them are publicly owned, some of them are privately owned, but a really robust suite of options. And when you're using that big piece of metal, you are using it, you probably don't own it, and you're using it by the hour, so you have to pay full costs, and you're likely with someone else to make that cost cheaper.
That sounds great, Robin. And before I hand over to Sarika, you know, I just absolutely love that you're in charge and you said heavy metal. So I just have to show you all some heavy metal before we move over to Sarika. So Sarika, can you build upon this? We've got 2 fantastic global leaders already who've set out their plans. Can you support them and add to it?
Absolutely, yes. So because when we are talking about, equality, if we are talking about sustainable mobility, and when we are linking it to electric mobility, so I think we need to shift from individual vehicle to, share mobility, and this is the future. And I think I totally agree with it. And my final line I want to say is that, we need to plan, build for the mass and not for the class. And when we are talking about mass, then, we are talking about all this kind of transportation system, which is not individual vehicles and share mobility and buses and, walking, and even electric cycles. Like, that is, I think that is the future again. When we are talking about mobility, electric cycles, again, I can see it's a future, especially for the country like India, where people cannot afford a 4-wheeler as electric mobility, but a small vehicle or electric cycle can be a game changer for a country like India.
Fantastic. Of course, I'd have to be a dictator to do this, but as you were talking, I'm just imagining if we just press the stop button on all car manufacture globally, apart from the economic shockwaves it would send, I think we have ample solutions in the way you've described to utilize better what we already have, and to bring these new modes into our street spaces. But I suppose we're inevitably facing the tension of the old regime, if you like, and the possibilities that this new future could offer us. Emmanuel, let's see what Lagos can offer to us into this exciting mix.
Thank you. I guess looking forward, I think firstly it has to start with awareness. It has to engagement and making some noise about where we are. Like, we need to recognize that we are not doing very well. We need to recognize that we can do better. So that comes from individuals making that conscious effort to do something like leave my car at home. I know it's going to be stressful, but let me just try and make this little change. So I think it has to start with that. And secondly, it has to looking for research, data, insight, all those things needs to be coming on board. We need to have those data to make an informed decision about what to do. So those data can also then lead into our policy formation. So our policy are not just made from a campaign perspective, saying I'm just going to do this because I want to win an election. You are creating policy because you have empirical data that says this, and this are happening. If you make these changes, these things can happen. Then fourthly, I think we should be looking at the redesign of the infrastructure. I think we need to recognize that for us to move beyond just cars, we need to explore other means of transportation. We need to make conscious effort to create cycle lanes to make sure people will feel safe walking and they feel safe leaving their cars at home. And ultimately looking forward to a future whereby the infrastructure beyond just transportation will have improved, because that also we need to recognize that in terms of the economy, if things are happening very well, I can afford to stay in my house and not go to work. So in all these, 2030 is there, but I think there's still a lot of things to do regarding the awareness, the research, the data, the insight, informing our policy, and also investing in our infrastructure.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And I'm going to pretend as I pass to Juan that I'm his presidential special advisor and say, Mr. President, I've been listening to Lagos, Nigeria, and they say more research. I'm worried there's just going to be lots more research into the technical fix solutions. Please tell me, Mr. President, what type of research we need to really get this moving in the right direction. But you should also have the floor for whatever you want to set out. You're the president.
Yeah, well, I will actually remark two key words. The first one is public. In COVID-19, we really learned about the value of public. In Chile, we are very privatized society with a privatized health. And we realized that without the public sector, without really not only the community, but actually the public funding, we really were not able to cope with the crisis. And that also leads to transportation, of course, it's multimodality, but the value of public transport and the broader sense of public transport and the value of the public space. I think that may be a key word in general if we want to build the future. The second word is something that has been around in Chile for all these months, which is dignity. And we are not so good on really pointing out not only minimum standards, but dignity. What do we need to do to really not only think of, not thinking about those who are comfortable, but those who are not comfortable, those who don't have the minimum access. And in the word, that's the majority who don't have the minimum access to services and to the minimum to really have a good life. And I think that's, for me, those two words have been the key lessons these years. And I think maybe the politician will be happy because they are very catchy words, but somehow they're also very important to guide a budget. Otherwise, we'll be falling to the technological solution and maybe again in the trap that we have been for several years now.
Okay, thanks, Juan. Well, I'm conscious we're into our last 3 minutes, so I'm going to risk a really quick fire round for each panel member. Just your one sentence. We've had a wonderful conversation, I feel, in the last hour and a half. What's the one-liner you're going to go away and tell your friend or your family member afterwards? What did you make of it? So, Kate, let's come back to you.
Oh, a one-liner. Don't forget, it's all about people. It's about hearts and minds. It's about everybody.
Thanks, Kate. Robin.
Issues are global issues, and if you focus on, I think we're going to be able to solve them, but we have to put them in the terms of people's struggles.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Take responsibility. Yes, the government might not be there yet to help you, but individuals should take responsibility to see what they can do in their own little way to perhaps change their mode of transportation and ultimately make a bit of contribution to reducing to the climate change.
Thank you. And Sarika?
I must say walk the talk and walk the talk for that paradigm shift. That's it. Like, this is what we need.
And we know that you do this very well, Sarika. So keep walking the talk. Juan?
I think our crisis require not to be afraid of revolution.
Thank you.
That's very important.
And actually, I'm just going to, Douglas Gilmore leaves us, I think, with essentially the question, which may end up being the title for the write-up from this, which is Beyond Revolution, ? So he's already thinking ahead. So, okay, we have the revolution to get the change we need, but what do we do once we've had the revolution? There's still an awful lot of work to be done. Well, I think on that note, first of all, thank you very much to our audience. As ever, you've been wonderful. There's some fantastic questions that we've had fed across. Sorry, we haven't been able to pick them all up. A huge thank you to our panel and to the internet, keeping it alive for the whole session. Some of you going to bed now, some of you are going to have breakfast, but you've been very generous with your time and we really appreciate it. Thank you ever so much from me to everyone, and not least to Brogan, who is always sorting things out, making sure everything works well. There's a great team to work with on this Fireside Chat series. So Brogan, I'll pass back to you to sign us off, please.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you, panel members. That was a really interesting conversation. There was a lot going on in the chat, as you guys saw. Just a quick note that we will be following up this conversation at Transport Practitioners meeting on the 8th of July. I've put the link in the chat, so if you want to join us, let me know or drop me an email. And with that, I'll sign off. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Brogan.
Bye-bye.